Alright, I'm going to show you how to make this super weird looking wet moss with water drips on a brick texture using only Photoshop and Arnold. So, the first thing I did for this is to make the actual brick texture itself, so I didn't need to draw it or use something from online, I just applied a surface shader to a sphere in Maya and then gave it a grid texture on top of that. And then I used the Place 2D texture node to make more bricks, and there's a little button to do stagger, and you do that, and it pretty much makes you a perfect grid texture. Once you do that, just go up to Arnold and Utilities, and Render Selection to Texture, name it whatever you want, put it wherever you want, and make it the resolution of your final texture. Boom! Once that's done, I plopped that into Photoshop, and basically just started recoloring some of the bricks, while also clicking all of the wrong textures at once because I'm a maniac. So basically what I was doing is just sort of using that as a template that would allow me to add in the sort of stucco color between the bricks. And then I just went in and tried to add a little bit of variation of just different reds to make it a little bit more visually interesting. I probably could have gone a little bit more aggressive with this, but again, my goal here was just to see if I could do this all in Photoshop for fun. So okay, once I've done that, just kind of keep doing this for a while. I was trying to make it look a little bit grungy. And I also added to the stucco a little bit of like an inner glow just to try to make it look a little bit like grungy, tiny bit. It didn't super do a lot, honestly. I probably should have played with that a little bit more. So, the other thing that I did, I grouped that all together to be organized, then I just started penciling in with a janky little brush and low opacity some random patches of moss on this. Were I trying to do this nicely, I would have looked up reference. Using an internet texture probably would have been better. But again, I wanted to see if I could do this all in Photoshop for fun. So I tried to add a little bit of variation and highlighting within that, of just assorted random greens with my janky little brush. Not being, super crazy careful with this, obviously, and then just trying to add in a little bit of areas of shadows to kind of blend so it wasn't this crazy lime green moss, because I thought that ended up actually looking pretty strange. Once I was done with the moss, I ended up saving that out and just applying that to see sort of where it ended up and how things looked. I believe I ended up, rotating the ball a little bit, just to double check that, whatever positioning of the moss was like decent for whatever render I was doing. So within Photoshop, I grouped all of those things for my color texture, duplicated that group, and I called that the bump map. So what I'm going to do here is basically just make that a grayscale, and then just modify with levels and assorted other, inner glows or like color overlays, just modifying this so that it has a lumpy texture. For the brick, I wanted that raised off the stucco, so I'm making those brighter shades of gray verging on white. The stucco is going to be the deepest part of this, or black, and then the moss is going to be sort of somewhere in between. I was really struggling with this, trying to, if I cared, I should have like redrawn some of these values, but I was hoping to get a good combination of like high lumps and low lumps. Instead, I just sort of ended up messing with the levels until I had, some kind of arbitrary lumps. And then what I also ended up doing is adding a noise texture to the background, a fairly aggressive one, so that the bricks had a little bit of, interesting variation and texture to them. And then what I also decided to do is try and add in a few random water drips. Before I did that, I decided to just, save out a version of this and apply it and see kind of how weird it would look. It actually did pretty okay things. It also made the texture look significantly less shiny just because of how the light was trying to reflect off the bumps. So then I ended up going in and doing the same thing with Roughness, and my goal for this basically was a black and white map where the moss was very shiny because it was supposed to be wet for some reason, and the bricks were less shiny because, for some odd reason, they were not wet. Mostly, I was trying to force variation into my textures by deciding arbitrary parts of this were or were not wet, regardless of whether or not that made a lot of sense. I also decided that the roughness map wasn't terribly visible on the material, so I decided that the moss would have some random water drips oozing out of it, which you can see me drawing in now. The quality of these is highly questionable. Stylistically, I kind of like them. Realistically, not so much. So I just threw them under the moss so that it would look like there weren't water drips just floating on top of the moss. And those are white, so they're going to be super, super shiny or very not rough. And then Or did I do that backwards? I did do that backwards. Yeah, so here you can see that I did my map backwards, so my brick is really shiny because I'm an idiot, and then my moss is like very rough, which doesn't make sense. So all I did is I come back to my levels channels and just switch stuff so that the moss is black and that the background is white or very rough. Reapplied that map, and I should have something that actually gives me shiny water drips. I then also, of course, because I had water drips in the Roughness channel, I went to add them back in retrospect into some of my other channels. Because I did not do this in a single layer and the drips are just in their own layer doing their own thing, it was fairly simple to copy them into my other layers, and in this case for color I just made them a little bit dark as if the brick was damp in those areas. Turned the opacity down, did a light drop shadow just to sort of simulate, maybe the water was like wicking into the brick or something. This texture was pretty experimental, to be honest. So reloaded my color texture, get a little bit more detail in there. But in my mind, what really made this pop in terms of the actual drips is messing with the bump channel. What I did for that is basically the same thing, just copy my map in, and for this I added a indecisive shader. I was going for an inner glow for this, so for the bump it's going to basically sort of try to make it a little bit more round looking. This is a very quick and dirty way to make a bump map like this, but, it kind of works. So I was basically going for like a 50% gray bumped up to white, and you can see it's getting a little bit more variation within those. And then once I did that, I sort of played a little bit more with the opacity. I decided they were a little bit too aggressive, and just sort of kept noodling a little bit with that, and then just updating the textures to see how everything looked in Maya. This is pretty much how I do most of my texturing if I'm doing stuff in Photoshop, just like make a little tweak, do it again, keep everything on separate layers, so it's really easy to just sort of turn one thing white and one thing black without having to deal with a bunch of masks and all that junk. After that, this was pretty much done, so I just adjusted the lighting to show off the texture a little bit better. In this case, mostly just going for a brighter render where if you look on the upper left where the drips are, you can kind of see the light sort of shining across them, so you can actually see that slightly rounded bump map, is really mostly what I was trying to show off with that, because it's probably one of the most interesting question mark features of this. And then again, sort of messing with the different lights to try to achieve effect that I didn't find completely horrendous looking. The rest of this video is basically just me playing with lighting, and also applying new materials to this so that I can render out each map individually. So there will be one render with only the bump map, one with only the roughness, only the color, etc. The reason I do this is just I personally like seeing what my different channels are doing. It's kind of interesting when you're doing a texture study. But yeah, so that's pretty much the rest of this video. Hopefully somebody found this vaguely helpful while this giant pink ball of terror is just floating around in my scene. Have a lovely day.